So what I'm going to be talking about is the result of a collaboration between educators and materials scientists at SRI International. I am the educator. I'm from the Center for Technology and Learning at SRI, and my co-author, Marcy Berding, is the director of the Materials Research Laboratory at SRI's Physical Science Division. Which one again? This one?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh. Hold on. I wanted to go to the next one. Help me again. Oh, it's...
No?
No, the next one. Next slide. There we go. Oh, it's this bottom one.
Yeah.
Okay, I was going to the right, left. Okay. Yeah. So what we propose is a framework for how to structure curricula that introduces students cutting-edge energy projects aimed at reducing CO2 in the atmosphere. The framework is about finding elements in the new engineered systems that reinforce core ideas and cross-cutting themes from the new science standards and energy literacy principles, and also build the types of scientifically informed civic dispositions that we as educators strive for. The essence of the framework is to find connections between the standards and the technologies, then design student tasks that build understanding of those connections. Our exemplar focuses on chemical and bioengineering solutions to problems in sustainable energy and climate. Where the kind of technologies we're talking about is through carbon capture, CO2 capture from flue gases, and the harnessing of CO2 for biofuels. First, we focus on problem tasks that can be designed in such curricula from the perspective of a taxonomy of problem types, from the most well-structured to the most ill-structured. Ill-structured problems are the messiest ones and require complex thinking. There are 10 categories, starting from the most well-structured, which are logical problems, going down to the most ill-structured, which are we call dilemmas. This slide shows the first 5. As you can see, these problems go from the most simple applications of procedures that yield single correct answers to decision-making problems which require ever more complex open-ended thinking. Per problem type, the column on the right shows examples in energy education. I know there is much on this slide and on the next slide to read, so in the interest of time, I'll go through them quickly, but we'll be happy to send you the slides if you contact me. And I have my contact information at the end. In these next 5 problem types, we move to the most complex and difficult problems, from troubleshooting all the way up to design problems and dilemmas, when there is no clear consensually held conceptualization of what constitutes the critical problem, much less what would be a solution to the problem. Certainly climate change debates get into that dilemma area very quickly in the public. I will now present how an existing curriculum unit represents an example of how student tasks in the unit represent some of these problem types. The unit was developed for teachers in Ventura County, California, under my NASA project, Data Enhanced Investigations for Climate Change Education. You can find the curriculum on the DICE learning environment, a website devoted to posting of curricula around uses of data sets from NASA missions. The URL is at the top of the slide, dice.sri.com, DICE with 2 C's. The unit contains this sequence of 5 steps. Ascertaining from trend analyses severity of climate change in local region compared to other regions or the whole world. Number 2, rating the severity of local climate change as a problem compared to global climate change as a problem. 3, assessing the importance to the public good of local versus global climate change. 4, recommending regional action plan for mitigating climate change around energy supply or energy consumption or even CO2 mitigation. And then 5, planning and evaluation to determine the impacts of the recommended actions. I'm going to focus on step 4 in the remainder of my talk because this is the step that can be embellished through the finding of those connections between standards and cutting-edge energy technologies. Going back to the taxonomy, you can see that the 5 stages of the unit fit within certain categories, but the activities do not follow sequentially, from most well-structured to most ill-structured. That's because the sequence is logically ordered by what one would expect to do trying to address climate change challenges, not according to where it fits pedagogically on the problem type continuum. The continuum that we will be talking about from here on in red on the slide has to do with construction of solutions as a design problem. The 5th component, which is about evaluating impact of a solution, is relatively more structured than is the formulation of solutions, because once a solution path is agreed upon, evaluation, while complex and challenging, is at least a consensually endorsed need, and success metrics are, broadly speaking, relatively easy to identify. And I say strongly, I emphasize the relatively easy part. Students can be taught to make connections between how engineers pondering energy solutions develop design systems that draw on what we know about energy in the natural world. These connections are well aligned to the next generation science and engineering standards. The engineering solutions that the SRI materials scientists and engineers are working on are about 1, searching for alternative energy sources for human consumption, and 2, mitigating carbon emissions from existing fossil fuel energy extraction technologies. 3 types of carbon capture are being designed and tested: uses of solvents, membranes, and sorbents. The team at SRI is also leveraging the membrane technology to explore improved efficiencies in desalination, a practice that is tied to prospects for adapting to climate change. In the energy literacy principles that the Energy Department has put out, the 5th principle is the most relevant to the instructional potentials of these engineering projects. That principle is about how energy decisions are influenced by many different types of factors. Curricula about designed engineering systems and processes for carbon mitigation would aim for achieving maximum scientific feasibility and productivity out of the process. There are also connections to other of the essential principles that get into more of the details about the different engineering designs. In red are the key relevant concepts pertaining to the flow of energy. Thinking in terms of systems, knowing how we consume energy, what the sources are, and what the consequences are. Knowing the consequences would be a long-term goal for evaluation as the systems get designed, piloted, and deployed. I will be focusing pretty much on the consequences of the different SRI technologies at this point. I will now go on to present the 4 technologies that the team is developing, thanks to the support from U.S. Department of Energy. First, we examine the 3 types of carbon capture. CO2 capture with membranes is an example of a simple design system. And this understanding of what makes up a simple system is part of the NGSS cross-cutting theme of systems and models. By the way, NGSS is the next generation science standards. I should get away from mentioning acronyms too much here. Simply put, capture through membranes requires carbon dioxide molecules to pass through the membrane and other molecules to not pass through. Just want to mention before proceeding further, please understand that the visualizations I'm showing on these slides are not directly from the SRI team. They conform broadly with what the team is doing, yet some of the technical details may vary. So there's a little disclaimer as you look through these visualizations. Students can learn to see how CO2 capture is part of a larger design system involving fossil fuel power plants that produce flue gases, and a manufacturing system requiring clean rooms. With each of these technologies, I will describe some pros and cons that need to be weighed in the decision-making about their ultimate value. The membranes will last a long time, and that's good. Yet you need to have your chemical system in the membranes well controlled, that produces the membranes well controlled to avoid imperfections, so that only CO2 passes through the pores. And that's quite challenging. The next technology is CO2 capture with solvents. Introducing students to capture by solvents illustrates how energy is present whenever there are objects, sound, light, or heat. That's a standard. In fact, it's a grade 4 NGSS standard. The process of capture by solvents is an illustration of chemical energy and kinetic energy at work. It is a process of separation by dissolving and the chemical reactions that occur in the dissolving process. Solvent capture has its trade-offs as well. As with many of these technologies, the carbon footprint is critical. Students can ponder, is the amount of carbon emitted in the process less than the amount that is captured? If the heat that's needed to stimulate the dissolving process requires a lot of energy that in turn produces a lot of carbon emissions, then there is not a good argument for using it for mitigation. Students can also be stimulated to think more broadly about environmental sustainability when learning that the solvents degrade quickly and are difficult to dispose of in the environment. CO2 capture with sorbents is an instantiation of other uses of energy. This also reinforces standards. For example, the high school standard about how energy is conserved, yet can be converted to heat. In a weak chemical bonding, cooling bonds the CO2 to the sorbent, then heating frees it at a CO2 disposal location. As for advantages and disadvantages, CO2 capture with sorbents has the potential to require the least amount of energy. Yet some sorbents require steam to eventually release the CO2 from the sorbent, hence much energy is needed to generate all that steam. Lastly, we come to the work that the Materials Research Group is doing to harness alternative energy sources. Students can study algae farming as an example of how a simple natural system, which fits into the complex natural system of carbon cycling, can be harnessed in a design system. Specifically, that natural system, of course, is photosynthesis. They also can learn how the simple natural system of photosynthesis is only one part of a larger process of using algae as a biofuel source. This slide shows how 2 middle school science standards are reinforced through the study of algae farming and biofuel production process. Specifically, 2 middle school standards from the NGSS about how energy is bound up in the sugars that get produced through photosynthesis. Then how the high temperatures and high pressure required in thermal liquefaction results in hydrocarbons and fats for combustible fuel. Students can study how the scientists and engineers are figuring out how to make use of as many algae compounds as possible for biofuel, including the sugars and fats. But there are challenges pertaining to the best designs for bags and other containers of farmed algae. See, these farmed algae have to be put somewhere and grown, just like a crop. These containers need to maximize the amount of sunlight and CO2 that passes through without also permitting the algae to escape. Then, the best technologies for extracting the combustible components need to be perfected. Hydrothermal liquefaction, which is what the SRI group is doing, is only one type of process for doing this. So, in closing, I hope that I've gotten you to thinking about how you could form alliances that result in using cutting-edge science and engineering as opportunities to educate, not only about fundamental concepts in energy and engineering practices, but also to stimulate critical thinking about what we are going to have to do to mitigate climate change. And there's my contact information. Thank you.